Okay, so super great to be here with you guys today. I'm going to be talking about the meaning of sustainability, and I'm going to be putting it in the context of what I've been doing over the last few years. First, I'm going to go through a bit of the problem that we have today. You guys all know that we've got some serious challenges ahead of us on this planet, and so first we want to look at those before we look at what kind of responses we can have to them. I don't like using the word solutions because I think a lot of people talk about solutions, but it's more about a response and how we can change the way we behave. So we start off with the meaning of sustainability, and I like this definition. A sustainable society is one that satisfies its needs without diminishing the prospects of future generations. And the issues that we have today, I think really if you start off with the Stockholm Resilience Center's 9 planetary boundaries, it gives a really good picture because we often hear about climate change as the main issue, right? But it's actually quite a lot of different issues that we've got going on. And if you look at the main ones, so here's like we're within the boundaries, and then here we're starting to get outside of the boundaries, and here we're like way outside of the boundaries already. So where are the ones that we're outside of? It's biochemical cycles. So that's like nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon, and water primarily. And that's sort of like you think about your body, it's like your circulatory system, right? What moves the blood and the nutrients around in your body. And then we've got biosphere integrity. And that's all, think about all the animals, the species that are going extinct. We hear about that a lot, but what we don't think about is how many individuals or populations are gone. So you think about like how many millions of elephants there were in Africa just like 30 or 50 years ago. And then how many there are now. They're not endangered as a species, but the populations are gone. And how does that affect the local ecosystems that they've been a part of for millions of years? And if we look at this original one that's on their website is from like 1915, and then just recently, just last year, they did an update, and you can see it's not getting better, right? It's getting worse. So we've got serious challenges. I'm personally focused on agriculture because if you look at how agriculture impacts the rest of the pie, it's quite significant. So you hear a lot of farmers talking about, well, we're only responsible for 11 to 15% of sort of greenhouse gases. But then if you look at the total footprint of food production in the world, and you think about deforestation, that makes up something between 15 and 20% of the problem. And agriculture impacts that massively. And then you've got transportation, because we don't go to farms usually to get our food. We go to the store. And we've got global supply chains. So stuff is shipped all over the place. And then we've got processing and packaging. How often do you buy food that's just food without a box or a plastic bag? Almost never, right? And then you've got freezing and retail. Don't think about that, but you've got to store the food. That takes energy. And then there's the waste. A huge amount of what we eat or produce as food doesn't get eaten. It just gets wasted. So the total footprint of agriculture is huge. And then if you think about on top of it, over the last 100 years, the amount of cultivars that have disappeared. So cultivars, you've got all the wild species, right? Like all the trees and all the bushes and everything that we don't eat that's just evolved naturally. And then we have all of our food. It didn't evolve naturally. It evolved with us. You could say that that's natural, but it's a symbiotic relationship. We help these plants move in a specific direction. So if you take corn, for instance, right? Corn was just a tiny little thing like this 9,000 years ago. And we kept breeding it and breeding it and breeding it until now we've got this monster thing that's just full of sugar, right? And we use that all over the place. And what happens when you do it that way is we go from 307 varieties, this is just in the States, to 12 within just 100 years. So that's another issue. And what you see here is the bottleneck, okay? And that's kind of what we've created in the last 100 years. So what we're really looking at in the big picture is that we had a nice ecosystem for millions of years, relatively stable. I mean, it fluctuated, but relatively stable. And in fact, the biodiversity was increasing and increasing and increasing, and we've never had as much as we had just 100, 200 years ago. And then now suddenly, boom, we're here. And so we have to find a way to open these bottlenecks up, right? And that's our job, is to figure out, well, how can we do that so that we can get enough diversity through so that we can have a stable ecosystem for our future generations. Okay, so that's the context. And my story is that I used to work in IT. So this is me in Apple, working for Apple in Cork, and this is before iPhones. They didn't even have iPods back then when I was working for Apple, okay? So this is 2003, and sorry, that was a little fast. I worked in IT for about 10 years, and I realized that IT, although it's great in some ways, didn't really seem to be much of a solution. So I started thinking that, well, technology's got to be the answer, right? But we just need to move away from fossil fuels. We need solar panels, and we need windmills. And we need people to make that change. So I got involved in politics. So in 2015, I ran for the municipal board here in Naas, and I got elected. So this is the 2015 annual convention in Oslo, okay? So you can see I'm for bicycles and solar panels, basically, okay? And after a couple of years there, I started realizing that, well, I want to do a better job at explaining to people what we can do, not just what the government can do, but what can we do from the ground up? Because you've got bottom-up solutions and you've got top-down solutions. And some people will say, well, the bottom-up solutions are useless. We need only top-down. I think we need both. We're in a crisis. In a crisis, we need to do everything we can to solve the problem, okay? So I wrote a little article that says, we are creating the future world together, okay? Future of the world together. And in it, I talk about the 3 B's. In Norwegian, it's bil, biff, og bolig. And now they've added 2 more, butikk and børsen. And what that means is, these are the things that you need to think about if you're going to try and make an impact yourself in your own life. Starts off with bilen, which is symbolic for transportation in general. Okay? So your biggest footprint is how you transport yourself around. The second one is biff, which represents food. So what are you eating? Where is your food coming from? How is it being made? And the third one is bolig, which is where you live. How is your house built? How do you heat your house? How do you repair your house? What do you have in your house? And then the next one is butikken. It's shopping. What do you do when you go to the shopping center? What do you invest your money in? And the last one is børsen. Where do you put your money? Right? How do you invest your money? And this Cultura Bank is a sustainable bank that only invests in sustainable projects. So this was written for that bank in 2015. And I was basically just talking about getting into growing stuff. See, I've got a carrot there. And then electric cars and that sort of stuff. Just sort of going in the direction of cutting back and changing what I'm doing. And then later on, this is on my website, I wrote this article. This is a couple years ago because as I continued to progress, I started to get a little bit more into it. I started doing the calculations. And if you do use a carbon calculator, there's loads of them online, you can calculate your own footprint, and it'll tell you what you need to do to cut back and where, and how you can do it in the best manner. So everybody's heard of reduce, reuse, and recycle, okay? So in this article, I go through that, and I really just focus on balancing our individual carbon budgets, and I compare flying to growing your own food, mathematically, scientifically. Compare the two in terms of carbon kilos, okay? Feel free to read it. In there, I look at reduce, reuse, and recycle. And then now again, they've added a couple more. Now it's refuse first to buy or consume, and then reduce, and then reuse, and then repurpose, and then recycle. And they're also in order of the biggest impact. So it's not random. And you very often hear people talk about recycling when they talk about the environment. That's the one with the least impact. Why are people talking about that one? Because it's the easiest. In this municipality, 40% of the people recycle, just to put it in perspective, okay? So we've got a long way to go. Basically, what I write in that article is that I stopped flying, because flying is the absolute biggest footprint that any of us have. If you're a flyer, that's the first thing you want to reduce. And in my company, I first just made agreements because I was a key account manager, so I was flying all over the world. Every quarter in the business world, every quarter you have to have a quarterly business review. And then you have to go, so I was in IT, so I would go to HP, I would go to Dell, I would go to Apple, 4 times a year, each company. So after a while, I was like, this is crazy. I can't keep flying like this. So I just made deals with them. I said, look, can we just do it every other quarter, and then the other ones will just do it virtually. And I'm like, yeah, that's actually not a bad idea. But we have not just my carbon budget, but everybody's carbon budget just there, right? So there's all kinds of things you can do that actually save you time, save you money, save the environment. I'm not saying everybody should stop flying. I've had like 2 continental flights, 2 one-way continental flights in the last 5 to 10 years. So it's been like 10 years since the last time I visited my family in the States. All right, so think about things in terms of importance, not just randomly. You know it's good for the environment. I'm going to do it because it's good for the environment. Think about how big your impact is. That's the important thing. And so after transportation, which I sorted, electric car, cutting back, not flying, then the next one is food. Okay, so then I got myself a small farm, and I started learning about growing. I didn't know anything at all. And 2011 was the first year. It was a complete catastrophe. 2012, I gave up because it was the year before was so bad. I was like, I'm not even going to try. It was terrible. And then by 2014, I met the Norwegian seed savers. And then I started learning more about ecology and how to deal with soil health. And I realized, wow, if I know how the soil works, that first half meter of soil, if I can relate to that scientifically, anything will grow in good soil, right? But if you don't have good soil, you can forget it. It's not going to work. So once I figured that out, I was like, okay, but what about Norway? Norway's pretty extreme. We're really far north, right? We're as far north as Alaska. So probably we need microclimates. And I started growing I made my own little raised bed that was like the size of one of these desks, and I grew some tomatoes in there, and that worked really well. I was like, okay, well, maybe I can find a greenhouse. And there was a guy not far from here who was retiring, and I just bought his greenhouse, a used greenhouse. I deconstructed it, I moved it to my farm. 2015, this is what it looked like. 2016, that's what it looked like. So that's literally the first season. I got the membrane up on the 20th of May, which is really late. So I really could only grow pumpkins that year. And then that year, the Norwegian seed savers established themselves as a national community seed bank here in Nes. But it was for the whole country, and it was at Gamlevann. And I was just right on the other side of the river, so I was like, I'm going to that. And since I'd been in politics, they were like, can't you be involved in organizing? So I got involved in organizing. I helped set together the board, and then they invited me onto the board, and I've been on the board ever since. Okay, so what are community seed banks? Everybody's heard about the Svalbard seed bank, right? That keeps the world's seeds up in the mountains, okay, up in the permafrost up in Svalbard, deep inside the mountain. They store it there because it's constant temperature at around minus 20 degrees. So it's really good to keep seeds long term. That's called ex situ. That means basically in the freezer, right? Slow down the genetics and everything that's going on, the entropy, so much that nothing is changing more or less. And that way you can store seeds for hundreds of years. Most seeds. Some seeds can't, but most of them. What a community seed bank does is they keep it in situ. And that means that they're reproducing it every year, or at least every 5 or 6 years. And that way they're allowing the plants to adapt, right? So adaptation doesn't really happen on the individual generation level. It happens intergenerationally. And it happens as a response to its ecology, right? So if you freeze everything down and 100 years later you take it out of the fridge and the whole environment's changed, what do you think will happen with those seeds? Most likely struggle at the very least to adapt because they missed out on 100 years of evolution in the most critical time when it was the most important for them to be doing the reproduction. Okay? So remember the earlier slide, how little diversity we have left? So we're trying to make sure that we keep those, okay? And in Europe, there's something called Let's Liberate Diversity. It covers all of Europe, and each country has their own community seed bank. Some of the biggest and oldest ones are Arkenua. They have 15,000 members, and they were founded in 1990. And the original one is Seed Savers Exchange from the States, and that was founded in 1974. So I got involved in that, and then the next year, 2017, I went full on into seeds. So these are carrot seeds and tomatoes, all kinds of stuff, chilies. And fast forward to last year, expanded outside of the greenhouse. This is a milpa, which is a Mexican word for like 5 sisters. You've heard of the 3 sisters maybe, pumpkins, corn, and beans. They would always be grown together, traditionally. And so I basically did that, but since corn is a bit hard to grow in Norway, you don't get very good crops. So I substituted corn with sunflowers instead, because sunflowers allow the beans to climb up. So that gives structure for the beans to climb. And then the beans are nitrogen binding, so they make their own nitrogen, which most plants can't do. And then the pumpkins, they make this canopy, which keeps all the weeds out. So you don't have to do that much work, and you get 3 out of 1. Now, if you do an analysis of a milpa, you'll find that it has the same amount of calories as if you just grew corn in the field. But the benefit is you get way more nutrients, because pumpkins have a different set of nutrients, beans have another set of nutrients. You also get more protein, because nitrogen, protein, okay? And diversity, plus it's beautiful. And you don't have to stop at 3. You can do 5, you can do 7, you can just choose. Build a nice little system, a little ecology there. And then if you're also saving seeds out of it, then you're stacking functions, right? And that's a permaculture term. So that was last year, and this is just a couple of like bird's eye views of it. I had to sell my farm last year, which sucked. But I won't get into that now. When you do an analysis, well, we did an analysis of the soil in my field before and after. And if you compare here, you've got, if you look at the differences between these, so this is the amount of carbon that's in the soil, right? So in the greenhouse, 4%. In the outside field, 2.7, and then originally 1.5. And that's only in a matter of years. So that's a huge boost in carbon. But look at all the other factors. It's just a huge boom, right? And so it's all about learning how to do things regeneratively so that you don't take out more than you're putting in. You put more in than you're taking out, right? And that's about understanding how ecology works on a scientific level. But not just on a scientific level, it's also about connecting to it deeply. So I wrote this article called Ecosystems Resonance, which is about a feeling that I had one day when I was working with my hands in the soil. And suddenly I felt like it was just some kind of weird thing that like make your hair stand up. Everything seemed to connect somehow. It's like the difference between playing cello on your own and practicing for like 15 years and feeling like it wasn't that great. And then suddenly somebody puts you in a room with a bunch of experts and you're like, oh my God, this is what resonance is about. This is how it all works when it all feels together. And in an ecosystem, it's the same. If you get to the right level, the ecosystem is just, it resonates. It gets to a kind of, everything fits together. The insects fit with the birds fit with the soil fits with the plants, and then you're on a totally different ballgame, and it's a totally different experience than just driving your tractor up and down a lane all the time. So for me, it's not just about the science, but it's about a deeper connection to ecology and the joy that you get out of that. And I think what we've sort of given up in our modern world is that ability to really connect with our ecology on a deep level. So that's something I really hope more people will experience. But to get there, you still need to have the science. You have to be able to understand what you're doing. You can't just go into an ecology and suddenly be resident, just like you can't suddenly show up in an orchestra with your guitar and think that you're going to be able to align with them. You're not, right? It takes years of studying and practice to get there. So in my case, I studied philosophy and intellectual history before, and so I try to look at the intellectual history of ecology as a science. So not organic agriculture, is a bit of a different thing, but the science of ecology. So it really starts with evolution and Charles Darwin. You could say it goes further back, but basically it really starts there. But in terms of looking at the world as a whole, the biospheric perspective, you could say that it starts with Vladimir Vernadsky, who wrote The Biosphere in 1926. And that's one of the first times that a scientist put the whole thing together and did a really good analysis of how the whole biosphere works. And then you've got Schrödinger, who writes What is Life in 1944, where he explains the connection between entropy and reproduction. Okay, and I'm going to get back into that in a minute. From there, we get The Fundamentals of Ecology, which is the textbook has been since 1953 for people studying ecology. And that's Eugene Odum and his brother Howard T. Odum. And the difference between them and the ecologists that came before them is that they were really looking at ecology from an energy perspective. So thermodynamics, the motion of heat, how energy moves, that was sort of the backbone of their understanding of how ecology works. Out of that, we get permaculture. David Holmgren attributes Howard T. Odom as being his main leader. And I'm into permaculture. I think the permaculture ethics and the design process are super useful. Okay, so the laws of thermodynamics. This is something that you guys probably already know, right? So what's the first law? Energy is never destroyed. It just changes form. And the second law, energy goes from concentrated to dissipated. So when you got a cup of tea and you leave it on the table for a while, what happens to it? Right. Why does it get cold? Exactly. Heat dissipates. So that's entropy. Okay? It never goes the other way around unless you do something to it. And by doing something to it, it means you have to burn something. Okay? So what do we get of an insight from this? We're doing the same thing, right? That's why we're constantly eating, because we're trying to offset the entropy. Right? We're trying to keep our temperature at 37 degrees all the time. And we need to be able to build, right? So we need to be taking in energy in the form of food, and oxygen, and water, so that we can maintain our structure, maintain our order, our internal order. So we create external disorder and internal order. So all living bodies that give off heat are somehow connected in an irreversible process that is happening everywhere. That's pretty mind-blowing when you stop to think about it. And entropy is the measure of the disorder of things. Now that's like a super simple explanation of entropy. Entropy is actually super complicated. And people study it their whole lives and literally go mad studying it. This documentary here I highly recommend. It's on Amazon Prime, and it's called Order and Disorder, The Forces That Drive the Universe. And in it they go through the intellectual history of energy. They start with before Carnot, who starts with, looking at how steam engines work. So it's really with the industrial age when we started using steam engines. We started trying to figure out how we're going to make these engines more efficient. So how does heat work in an engine, right? And trying to make an engine more efficient, they had to understand how does that work. And so what they first realized is that all heat engines work on the difference between hot and cold, just like we were just talking about with a cup. Same thing, right? You got to burn something, got to make it hot, then you make the steam drives the engine, okay? And then later on they realized, okay, especially Rudolf Clausius, who really sort of formulated the second law of thermodynamics, right? And he realized it's just moving in one direction. But then Ludwig Boltzmann comes along and he actually formulates it into an equation, okay? And that is actually a paradigm shift. And something really interesting, if you studied intellectual history, you'll notice something, that paradigm shifts happen regularly, okay? So the one that everybody knows about is Copernicus, when we went from thinking that the world was the center of the universe to we realized that the sun is the center of the solar system, right? The universe we don't even really know, right? Okay, so that was a huge swap. What happened to the people, the scientists that first came up with those ideas? Some of them got burnt at the stake, right? Because it was blasphemy. You weren't allowed to say that. So what happened to Boltzmann? He got super criticized in Vienna by other scientists. They were like, I don't believe this. It's baloney. He showed that there are many more ways for atoms to be disordered than ordered. And he made it into a formula. He got so depressed that he killed himself because nobody believed him. But he was right. And he's a historical figure because of that, okay? And he caused, or he was a part of, because it's not just one person. When paradigm shifts happen, it's a whole group of people. Science happens like that. So a lot of scientists have to work together to figure stuff out. Nobody figures it out on their own. We're all building off of the knowledge of generations before us, right? So that's fairly recent when you think about it, right? 150 years ago. It's not long ago. I mean, he died in 1906. And then we have a change at the same time away from an anthropocentric worldview to a biocentric worldview. The difference, anthropocentric, human-centered, biocentered, the planet-centered, right? And the whole ethics that go along with that. So this is an image that explains a paradigm shift. right? You can be looking at it as a tree, or you can be looking at it as a monkey and a lion. They're both right? Depending on how you look at it. So you could say that the world is the center, if you want to. You could say the world is flat, and from one perspective, that's true. The world seems flat. It seemed to us flat for many, many generations, right? But it's, how can you change your mind about things? And that's what we need to do today. So if we're looking at it from a permaculture perspective, the first principle is observe and interact. And the second one is catch and store energy. Not dig it up out of the ground, burn it, and throw it into the atmosphere, okay? So how do you do that? How do you catch and store energy? Well, you have to start thinking about the world in terms of entropy and syntropy, okay? So disorder and order. War was an example of something that's very entropic, destroys all kinds of stuff. Forgetting is a kind of a form of entropy. Monoculture is a kind of entropic process. Consumerism, inactivity, burning fossil fuels, and traveling. Those are all entropic behaviors. And then if you think about syntropy, you've got information, super syntropic. Okay, so what we're doing now, hopefully, I'm giving you guys a bunch of information that's taken me my whole lifetime to accumulate, and you guys are able to then just get that information like that. You save all that energy, all that time, boom, you're at that level. And then you guys can keep building off of that. But you need some memory involved, and you definitely need some photosynthesis because you're going to be eating something. Not a bad idea to do some seed saving, and if you're going to do that, you want to do it in a diverse way, and you need a microclimate for that in this ecology, and for that, design and permaculture. Okay, so those are all syntropic ways of doing things and looking at things. And the thing that really makes humans humans, and what makes life life, really, is our ability to bring things together, our ability to create order in a disordering universe. Right? So a lot of people know about energy, but a lot of people don't know that there's different qualities of energy. So if you start off, this is from Odom again, okay? So this is the hierarchy of the rank of energy in terms of quality. So the lowest quality is sunlight. You might think, wow, sunlight is the lowest quality? But think about it. It takes 8 minutes for the energy to get from the sun to the planet. By then it's been heading out, right? And it's only because life evolved photosynthesis that we're able to capture all that energy, and it takes time to do that, right? Can't do that during the wintertime. So it's a very slow process. Now, sunlight affects the wind, right? Photosynthesis, tides, mechanical energy, moving your body around. Chemical energy, a little bit higher. Consolidated fuels, river water, food, pretty high, pretty organized, pretty ordered. Electric power. We think about how little electric power there was until we started burning fossil fuels, right? Us. We couldn't be as many people on the planet today if we didn't have fossil fuels. Wouldn't work. And then at the very top, information. And then here you can see, if you're going to take the sun's energy and you're going to transfer it and you're going to measure how much, look at the information, how much value that is. And how much of that do we waste every day? Insane amount. All right, so we've got the Sustainable Development Goals. Here they are. So what I try to do is I try to apply permaculture and apply syntropic, entropic, anthropocentric, biocentric to these goals. Why? Because it's important to organize things in terms of their impact, like I've been showing before. Not everything is the same. Reduce, reuse, and recycle have 3 different levels of intensity. So on this side, I've got the biocentric ones, and this side, I've got the anthropocentric. Notice anything a bit off there? Kind of a little bit out of balance there, maybe? I wonder why. Maybe because we live in an anthropocentric world still. We haven't really made the swap over to biocentric yet, okay? So there's nothing wrong with these goals. They're all awesome goals, but they're mostly focused on humans, okay? And then if you look at them in terms of syntropy and entropy, same thing. You've got a lot of syntropic ones, but you've also got actually some entropic ones. That's a bit weird. Why are some of our goals entropic? Ever thought about that? And then there's the ones that are in between. But the fact is that all of us are both entropic and syntropic. when you're eating something, you're breaking it down, creating disorder so you can make internal order. So it's not like entropy bad, syntropy good. We're both. We're entropy and syntropy, disorder and order. But we need to find a way to balance it out, right? So it's super helpful to look at the world through this perspective and look at our problems through this perspective so that we have better tools so that we can organize, so we can do things in the right direction. And the only goal that I'm critical of is decent work and economic growth. I'd put degrowth in there. And that's today probably sacrilege still for most people, right? That's like, you can't talk about degrowth. Okay, but I think we need to start thinking about that. We have to start thinking about how can we deal with less. Can we have a good life, a healthy life, a resonant life that's deeply connected to ecology, but where we're not thinking about making more money. We're thinking maybe about making less money, but having more time and having more joy and making less of an impact, negative impact, okay? So it's just, I'm not going to get too deep into that, but something to think about. And if you guys want to hear podcasts about the scientists who are really working on this today and are trying to find real solutions, Nate Hagen's The Great Simplification is awesome. He's got movies, he's got videos, and he's got podcasts. I listen to it all the time, and he's got so many amazing scientists on his show. And he talks about how we're energy blind, right? Exactly what I was talking about today. We don't understand how energy works. Even the scientists don't really get it, a lot of them. Definitely the politicians tend to not really understand it properly. And then he talks about us as a superorganism, which is an interesting idea. We're not all individuals just, we're also really connected. We're all one in many ways, right? It's a biospheric perspective. He talks about the history of humans, and then he talks about the future. And he believes that we need to have some kind of a simplification. We have to have a simpler way of doing things. So really advise to check that out. And I'm getting to the end here, and we'll have some questions, but I just want to show an interesting graph here about agriculture. So this is a graph that shows the amount of people who worked in agriculture in Norway in 1950 and today. So in 1950, 25% of the Norwegian population worked in agriculture. Today, 2.5% work in agriculture. Now, a lot of people who are for growth will say, that's amazing. Look how much progress we've made. In my opinion, that's terrible, because that means all those people are now no longer really connected to what they're eating. They have no connection to it. They don't understand it. They're not able to resonate with their food at all. So in my world, we would change this graph, and it would start going up again. And more people would start doing farming directly, not with machines. Maybe some machines, some technology, lots of information, but not the way we use machines today. Totally different way of doing it. And that's because this is the 10,000-year perspective. So that was the 50-year, 10,000-year perspective. This is how much energy we used in agriculture, right? Industrial Revolution, kaboom. And here's where we are now. And we have only a few choices. We're hoping, a lot of people, that there'll be a techno explosion, right? Elon Musk and the like. Go to Mars and, I don't know, fake food. And then you've got techno stability, which is what sort of like I believed in for a long time. That we can just live at this high level of consumption, but just not damage the planet. Sounds a bit like a pipe dream to me. And then you've got where we're heading, as you all know, collapse. And then you've got the energy descent path, which is the permaculture way, which is find a way to use less energy, have more time, and do things differently, right? And it's not about going back to the Stone Ages. We're not talking about dropping everything. We're talking about being creative, working together, finding a totally different way of doing it, and using knowledge instead of just energy, raw power energy. Instead of mechanical power, use knowledge instead to do a much, much better job and to think about the whole biosphere. So, summing it all up, sustainability has to first and foremost be about ecological sustainability. That's why if you're going to organize things in the right order, you can talk about sustainability all you want, but if there's no ecological sustainability in what you're doing, it's not sustainable, okay? Then personal sustainability. You have to think about what you're doing. How are you impacting things, right? And to do that, you want to try and find a way to have some joy in it. If you're not having fun, it's not going to be sustainable, right? And there's loads of fun to be had besides just gaming, right? And making money. For me, focusing on reproduction is super fun. That's the highest form of order, order on top of order. And then finally, community sustainability. Find a way to connect with your community and do things together, because that's even more fun, right? And networks, you know, if you look in nature, look at the way mushrooms and trees relate to each other. It's an amazing network that's been going on for ages, right? So we need to learn from the patterns in nature and try to mimic them. So that's what I'm working on nowadays. As you guys know, we're working here on the school. We put in an application just a few days ago for £500,000 to build 2 greenhouses. One that we're going to hopefully put right out here, and that one we'll put on my farm. And they're inspired by the teepee design. I've gone through all kinds of different designs. I've written about it on my website if anybody wants to read about it. And what I found is that if you look at all of the structures of the indigenous populations around the Arctic, which is where we live, America, Siberia, Canada, Scandinavia, they all have the same basic structure. It's basically just branches and poles, trees, young trees, and some kind of a membrane. All organic, and they all their entrances all face east. Isn't that weird? Well, it's the rising sun. It's the coldest part of the day is the morning, so you want to be able to get the sun coming into your entrance first thing. Makes sense. This is permaculture design, right? And it's copied all over. Why? Because it's in harmony with nature. It's resonant. So we're going to do the same thing, but we're going to make a modern membrane, and we're going to put windows on the south side, which is where all the sun comes in, and then we're going to add another door on the west side so that we can have circulation and a couple of vents. And on the 28th, I've already ordered one of these, just a small one to test it out, like 40 square meters. And I've been up the last few weeks chopping trees and barking them in the forest. So on the 28th, we're going to have a little celebration, spring celebration on my farm. And the Ries community is invited to come. Probably there'll be a band playing music. We have our own bakery there, so we'll probably have pizza and bread and that kind of stuff. And we're going to celebrate the beginning of a whole new season in a whole new greenhouse on a whole new farm. And traditionally, they always had a sort of an initiation ceremony whenever they set up a new teepee. So that's basically what we're going to be doing. Oh, there's supposed to be one more, but that's it. All right, that's the... Thanks. Okay, does anybody have any questions?
What are some reasons for why you prefer permaculture to agriculture?
To agriculture? Well, the history of permaculture has kind of 2 fathers. You've got Bill Mollison, who is really interested in natural farming. So he was looking at all the old indigenous ways and trying to use that and make a modern version of it. And it was also a response to global warming. So it starts in 1974 in Tasmania. And it was because there was a book that had come out 2 years before called Limits to Growth, which said we need to limit our growth on this planet. And the permaculture is like, okay, how are we going to do that now? Not wait for some techno solution, but now. And they went to 2 sources. Bill Mollison went to all the old cultures and looked for answers. And David Holmgren went to ecology, like I just showed you guys, right? So I'm more on the scientific ecology side, but I think Bill Mollison had a lot of good stuff, and a lot of the old cultures have super good methods, the teepee, right? There's all kinds of great stuff that we can pull from the past.
So you basically, like, what are the differences? Like, how would you do permaculture and how would you do agriculture?
Well, the difference, it depends, because agriculture is not one thing. There's many different ways of doing agriculture, right? So like in the West, America and Europe and China and a couple of other places as well have massive agricultural systems with huge machines, and you've got like very few people on huge, huge areas. I don't really believe that that's the answer. I think that that's a part of the problem, because it makes everything into one. It destroys the diversity. It's super energy intensive, and it separates us from our ecology. So in my world, in the future, let's say we go back to how it was in the 50s. 25% of the population are in agriculture, right? And we're relating to it in a completely different way. We don't have all these global supply chains. We have local supply chains. And people start moving out of the cities. If you look at the pendulum swing from agriculture, the way modern agriculture has, how has that affected populations? Oh, it's read Wendell Berry's The Unsettling of America. He talks about how the American Midwest was unsettled from the 30s when the big machines started coming in, or really it starts maybe in the 1880s, until by the 50s, everybody had moved off of the farms and they were all living in the city. Right? So it means that we'd have to move back to the countryside. And for a lot of people, that's like, oh, terrible. But I mean, if you think about it differently, and you think about it creatively, and you think about what a quality life is, it's a beautiful thing to be able to live in the countryside. People want to move out of the cities so that they can have peace and quiet in the countryside. But it doesn't mean that just moving out to the country is enough. We have to do it in the right way, right? So I believe smaller is better than bigger. I believe direct contact is better than through a machine. And less energy is better than more energy. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
How did you become so knowledgeable in your field?
Just studying and working. The first permaculture principle is observe and interact. So you have to actually get out there and do it, and you're going to make loads of mistakes, especially in the beginning. But the more you interact, the more steep the curve is. A lot of people just sit in front of their machines and get theoretical knowledge, and they never get out into the field. Get out into the field. Get your hands dirty. Interact with your ecology. Observe it. Learn from it. And then keep studying and mimicking people who have done good work. Look. We've never had access to more information about how things work. So study ecology. I mean, you can study agriculture, and there's a pretty decent school of agriculture here. But I would say, if you're just studying agriculture, you're not going to get enough information because it's not just an agricultural thing. The problem is that agriculture has been too focused on yields, right? On profits, on growth, and it hasn't been focused on sustainability. So we need to change the focus. We need to bring science in, and we also have to change our patterns of behavior. Anybody else?
Follow-up question to what you said. How do you think we're gonna? What is your solutions for changing people's perspective on the sustainability, not growth as an economical, but like more sustainable? How?
Well, I think what I try to do always is ground it in science and in the latest science, not old science. So this entropy-syntropy perspective blew my mind. I didn't know about that before 2018. So how many people have heard about that? And if you look at our economic system today, there are people who've criticized it because it doesn't take entropy into account at all, right? So we need to be changing our minds. And to do that, we have to find key ideas, and we have to understand them. And once we understand them, then we have to try and help other people understand them too. And it's not before enough people, you get critical mass of people who understand it, who are then working together, who can show that there's a different kind of way of doing things. That's when change will happen. But if everybody's just sitting thinking about all the problems all the time and nobody's working together to try and find a new way of doing things, and there's no language for how to communicate about it, we're not going to get anywhere, right? But the answers have always been staring at us. Like everybody knows that a hot cup becomes cold. That's like, oh, really? Right? But why? That's the question. Why does it become cold, right? So you have to ask the critical questions about the stuff that's staring you in the face. And that's what science is about, really asking, trying to understand it deeply, and then formulate it, and then try and change your perspective, and then change your attitude, and then change your behavior. Yeah. I don't know how much more time we have.
We have 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes.
So 1 long or 2 short questions, I reckon.
Just to let you guys know that on the 28th, there's a lady called Katarina Burka who works at another international school down on the, 2 hours south of here. And she's also been working on sustainability and all the stuff that we're talking about. She's actually writing a book about it. And she's going to be coming along with Martin Liembuller, who is a deep ecology professor, who's also written books on these subjects. So there'll be good, interesting conversations, and it's worth it to come if you guys feel like it. All right? Yeah?
What are your thoughts about regenerative farming?
Regenerative farming, I think it's super important. What I'm talking about is regenerative farming. Permaculture would fall under the category of regenerative farming, but permaculture is a bit wider because it's more about an ethical system and a design process. So regenerative farming is, generally speaking, if you sort of want to simplify it, it just means how can you build more carbon, more nutrients in the soil every year. That's sort of the crux of it. And there's all kinds of scientific ways of doing that. Permaculture is just related to that, but it's wider because it's not just agriculture. It's buildings, it's how you live your life, it's ethics, it's like a worldview. So I would say they're totally related. Agroforestry as well, very, very related.
You mentioned earlier about paradigm shifts. Do you see permaculture as potentially a paradigm shift?
I think permaculture is a part of a larger paradigm shift. It comes out of this entropy, syntropy way of looking at things. And that's not just permaculture. I mean, like I showed you in that documentary, this is hardcore science. And it comes from the industrial age. So it's nothing that just permaculture has. The problem is just that it hasn't trickled down yet to everybody. And paradigm shifts, generally, if you look at the history, paradigm shifts, it takes usually from the idea until the whole society adopts that view, about 200 years. We don't have 200 years. But luckily, I mean, we have 200 years, but we don't have 200 years to make the paradigm shift. But luckily, we've got tools, right? And there's way more people now. So I think I'm optimistic about that. If enough people start looking at the world differently and interacting and working together, I think we can make the change quickly.
This is not a question, but this is to add on what you're saying. For grade 9 and grade 10, guys, you are going to learn about that paradigm shift and look at environmental value system. So we're going to speak about ecocentric or biocentric that he mentioned, anthropocentric approach, and technocentric approach. So the information that he gave today is very, very important in our discussion about this environmental value system. How are we going to approach the problem within our ecosystem?
Thank you. I'll just close there, too, that there was a famous scientist called Thomas Kuhn who wrote a book called The Scientific... I forget the name of it right now. But he wrote it in 1960, and he was the one who came up with the term paradigm shift. And he looks at it from the scientific perspective. So how do paradigm shift happen in science, not just in the general population? So if anybody wants to look at that, it's an advisable book, but it's maybe a little bit higher. You'd get that at the university level probably. But there's no reason not to read university stuff at your age, in my opinion. All right.
You're raising your hand? No.
Okay, I think that's it then, huh?
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Mhm.
We will run